Hello, everyone, and welcome to Midnight Whispers. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin. I was 10 years old when this happened, living in Mesa, Arizona, in a neighborhood that most adults would describe as rough, but to me it was just home. I was a kid, completely unaware of how dangerous the world could be. I didn't think in terms of crime or bad intentions. I thought in terms of getting home on time, not upsetting my mom, and doing what I was told. At that age, your world is small, and you trust it because you don't yet know how much there is to fear. I used to walk to and from my friends' houses all the time. It was normal. My mom had one main rule: be home by 9. I took that rule seriously. I never wanted to be late. I would always start walking home around 8:40, giving myself enough time to get back without rushing. The walk wasn't long, just a couple of blocks. It was so routine that I never questioned it. This happened during a time of year when the sun set early, around 5:30 in the evening. By the time it was 7, it was already completely dark. That night, when I left my friend's house, it was fully nighttime. Streetlights were on, the air was quiet, and the neighborhood felt still in that way it does after most people have gone inside. I remember walking and thinking about nothing important, probably about school or what I was going to do the next day. I wasn't scared. I wasn't alert. I was just a kid walking home, counting down the minutes in my head so I wouldn't be late. Then I heard a woman calling my name. That alone should have scared me, but it didn't. I turned around and saw that it was one of my mom's friends. At least, someone I recognized as being connected to my mom. She wasn't someone my mom was close with, but she was familiar enough that I didn't immediately feel alarmed. I didn't know her name well, but I knew I had seen her before. That was enough for my brain to file her under safe. I smiled and said hello. She walked up to me and started talking right away. She told me that my mom had called her and asked her to come get me. She said something had happened at my house, that it was an emergency, and that I needed to go with her immediately. She said her husband was nearby and they were going to drive me home. Hearing the word emergency made my chest tighten. I instantly worried about my mom. I didn't question her story the way an adult might. I didn't think to ask why my mom wouldn't call me herself. I didn't wonder why someone else would be sent when I was so close to home. I just heard, "Your mom needs you, and something is wrong," and that was enough. I was only about 5 minutes away from my house. I could have been home so quickly. But I agreed to go with her. As we started walking toward her car, something inside me changed. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't logic. It was a feeling that hit my body before my mind understood it. My stomach dropped. My legs started to shake. I felt this deep, uncomfortable sense of dread that I had never experienced before. At the time, I didn't have the words for it. Now, as an adult, I know exactly what it was. My instincts were screaming. I slowed down and stopped walking. My heart was beating fast, and I felt confused. Part of me wanted to keep going because she was an adult, and she knew my mom. Another part of me felt like something was very wrong. That second part had never been so loud before. I asked her if we could call my mom. The woman didn't hesitate. She told me my mom was in the hospital. She said that was why it was an emergency. She said we needed to hurry. That answer made everything worse. I didn't know why, but it felt wrong. My legs felt weak, like they might give out. My hands felt cold. I remember standing there, frozen, my brain trying to keep up with what my body already knew. We were right next to the car now. The door was being opened, and then I heard it. My mom shouted my name. She shouted it as loud as she could with a fear and urgency I had never heard in her voice before. It cut through the night like an alarm. I turned instantly, without thinking, and walked straight toward her as fast as I could. I didn't look back. When I reached my mom, she grabbed me immediately. Her hands were shaking. She asked what was going on. The woman started talking fast, saying she was just giving me a ride home because she saw me walking. That wasn't what she told me, so I told my mom the truth. I said that the woman told me my mom had called her. I said she told me there was an emergency. I said she told me my mom was in the hospital. As I was speaking, the woman tried to interrupt me. I could tell she was about to change her story. Before she could, my mom cut her off. My mom just stared at her. The look on my mom's face is something I will never forget. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't anger yet. It was shock. Pure, cold shock. And then she said something that still sends chills through me when I think about it. She said very clearly and very quietly, you were trying to take my son." The woman froze. Her husband, who had been sitting in the car, suddenly leaned forward and started urging her to get in. He looked nervous, urgent. As I glanced toward him, my eyes caught something on the dashboard. There was a syringe. It was leaning against the windshield, and the moment he realized I had seen it, he grabbed it quickly and tried to hide it. I didn't fully understand what it meant at the time, but I knew enough to know it was bad. Very bad. My mom reached into her purse. She always carried a small pocket knife. Her entire body was tense, ready to fight if she had to. I think if that woman hadn't gotten into the car immediately, something very violent would have happened. They drove away fast. As soon as they were gone, my mom collapsed. She grabbed me and started crying uncontrollably. She kept saying, "I almost lost you. I almost lost you." Her voice was breaking. She was shaking as badly as I was. I didn't know what to say. I was in shock. I hugged her back, my face pressed into her, trying to understand what had just happened. We went home together in silence. That night, I didn't fully accept what had happened. My brain couldn't handle it. To cope, I convinced myself that maybe it wasn't as serious as it seemed. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe I wasn't really in danger. That kind of denial is powerful, especially in children. It's a way to survive something your mind isn't ready to face. But my mom knew. Later, she told me what she had felt that night. She said she suddenly had this overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that something was very wrong. She couldn't explain it. She just knew she needed to come find me immediately. She didn't wait. She didn't question it. She listened to her instincts and ran. Her instincts saved my life. My stepdad reported the incident to the police. A tip was filed. At the time, nothing seemed to come of it, and life slowly moved forward. We cut all contact with those people completely. About 3 months later, we got the news. The husband had been arrested. The police found child sexual abuse material on his computer. They found restraints in his closet. They found containers of propofol. And they found something that made my blood run cold even years later. They found pictures of me, pictures taken from my mom's Facebook, downloaded and saved on his computer. That meant I hadn't just been a random opportunity. I had been watched, studied, chosen. They believed I had been targeted for a while. When I learned that, something inside me broke in a way I didn't fully understand until much later. The reality of how close I came to disappearing hit me all at once. If I hadn't stopped to ask to call my mom, if my mom hadn't followed her instincts, if those 20 seconds had gone differently, I don't know where I would be. I don't know if I would even be alive. That knowledge stays with you. I never talked about it. Not really. I still haven't told most of my closest friends. It's not because I'm ashamed. It's because saying it out loud makes it real all over again. Writing it now still makes my hands shake. After that night, everything changed. My mom walked me everywhere. Every time I left the house, she walked with me until I was 13 and went to live with my dad. She didn't care what anyone thought. She wasn't taking chances. Neither was I. I have never ignored my instinct since. Ever. That night taught me something that no lesson, no warning, no true crime story ever could. Your body knows before your mind does. Fear isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's information. I don't consider myself a lucky person. Most of the time it feels like the odds are against me. But that night, I was lucky in the most important way. Lucky that I listened, even for a moment. Lucky that my mom listened sooner. My life was about 20 seconds away from being completely different. That's something I carry with me every day. A couple of friends of mine went through something on their honeymoon that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. It's one of those stories that doesn't just feel scary because of what happened, but because of everything they still don't know. The gaps, the missing hours, the unanswered questions. Even now, they don't really like to talk about it, and I understand why. They had just gotten married and decided to take their honeymoon at a resort in Mexico. It wasn't some ultra-luxury, high-end place you see in travel magazines, but it was nice. Clean, comfortable, right on the beach. They paid for it themselves and were proud of that. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They just wanted a few days away together to relax, celebrate, and start their life as a married couple. The first day went exactly how you'd expect. Travel, a check-in, unpacking, laughing about how strange it felt to finally be husband and wife. They were tired but excited, that mix of exhaustion and happiness you get after a big event like a wedding. That evening, they decided to head down to one of the resort bars on the beach. It felt like the perfect honeymoon thing to do. Sand, ocean air, music, drinks, and finally being able to slow down. They sat at the bar together, talking, laughing, watching the waves in the dark. The husband had a couple of drinks. Nothing excessive. He wasn't trying to get drunk. The wife was barely drinking at all. She was slowly sipping her first drink, taking her time. Neither of them were heavy drinkers, but the husband especially knew his limits. He knew what a couple of drinks felt like. Not long after they started drinking, things began to feel off. The wife started acting extremely intoxicated, far more than made any sense. She wasn't just tipsy. She was slurring her words, having trouble focusing, and seemed confused. At first, they both tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe the drinks were stronger than expected, or that travel exhaustion was catching up with them. But then the husband realized something was wrong with him, too. He felt far more drunk than he should have. Disoriented, heavy, sluggish. His thoughts felt slow and foggy, like he couldn't fully grab onto them. He knew this feeling didn't match the amount of alcohol he had consumed. It wasn't the normal progression of being buzzed or even drunk. It felt sudden and overwhelming. That's when the unease really set in. They both looked at each other and silently agreed that something wasn't right. This wasn't fun drunk. This wasn't honeymoon vibes. This was uncomfortable and scary. They decided to leave immediately and go back to their room. They didn't want to stay another minute. They stood up, unsteady on their feet, and left the bar. That's where their memory ends. The next thing the husband remembers is waking up hours later. he came to with a pounding headache, his mouth dry, his body aching in a way that felt deeper than a normal hangover. Before he could even fully open his eyes, he realized something was wrong. He was on the floor, naked, disoriented, confused. Then he heard his wife. She was hysterical. She was crying, panicking, barely able to speak clearly. She was also naked, on the floor, just as confused and terrified as he was. Neither of them had any memory of how they got there. No memory of leaving the bar beyond the decision to go upstairs. No memory of walking back to their room. No memory of unlocking the door. No memory of undressing. No memory of anything that happened in between. They looked around the room, and the horror deepened. The room had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, bags were dumped on the floor, clothes were scattered everywhere. Anything that could be opened had been opened, anything that could be searched had been searched. All of their cash was gone. All of their credit cards were gone. Everything. They felt sick, physically and emotionally. Their heads were pounding, their stomachs were churning, and their bodies felt weak. It was the worst hangover either of them had ever experienced, but it didn't feel like a normal hangover at all. It felt heavier, more brutal, like their bodies had been poisoned. Panic set in quickly. They were in another country, on their honeymoon, with no money, no cards, no memory of what had happened, no idea who had been in their room or what they had done, no idea how vulnerable they might have been. The wife was especially distraught. Being naked and unconscious with no memory of what happened is deeply violating, even if you don't know for sure that something worse occurred. The uncertainty alone was traumatizing. The husband was trying to stay calm, trying to ground both of them, but he was terrified too. They immediately tried calling family and friends back home. It was very early in the morning because of the time difference, and at first no one was answering. Every unanswered call made the panic worse. They felt completely alone. Eventually, they managed to get through to some mutual friends of ours. Explaining what had happened was difficult. They were shaken, emotional, and still not fully clear-headed. But they managed to get the basics out. They thought they had been drugged. They had been robbed. They had no money or cards. They didn't know what to do. Those friends sprang into action. They helped arrange for money to be sent to them, though it wasn't easy without credit cards and with international barriers. There were delays and complications, adding even more stress to an already overwhelming situation. But eventually, they were able to get enough money to cover essentials and make plans to get home. Throughout all of this, the most disturbing part never changed. Neither of them ever regained any memory of what happened after they left the bar. Not a single flash. No, not a sound, not a smell. Nothing. That empty space in their memory remains completely blank. They never found out exactly who did it. Whether it was someone working at the resort, someone watching tourists, or someone who followed them from the bar. They never found out how they were drugged, how they were brought back to their room, or how long they were unconscious. They never found out if anyone else was involved or how closely they had been watched. They made it home safely in the end, which is something they are deeply grateful for. Things could have been much worse. They know that. But survival doesn't erase trauma. Their honeymoon, which should have been one of the happiest times of their lives, became something dark and unsettling. A memory filled with fear instead of joy. A story they don't like to revisit because every time they do, it opens up that same sick feeling of vulnerability and the loss of control. They don't talk about it much. When it does come up, it's brief, vague, and quickly changed to another subject. You can tell it still affects them. It changed how they travel. It changed how they drink. It changed how much they trust unfamiliar environments, especially tourist-heavy places where people let their guard down. What makes the story so disturbing isn't just the robbery or the drugging. It's the realization of how easily it happened, how quickly a celebratory night turned into something dangerous, how little alcohol it took for their bodies to shut down completely, how expertly someone must have planned it. And it's also terrifying to think about how many people might experience something similar and never know the full truth. The lack of memory leaves you unable to process or fully heal because your mind keeps searching for answers that never come. They were lucky in the sense that they made it back alive, together. But luck is a fragile thing, and they know how close they came to something far worse. That knowledge stays with you. Even now, years later, the story still sends a chill through everyone who hears it. Not because it's sensational, but because it's quiet, ordinary. The kind of thing that could happen to anyone who just wanted to enjoy a drink on the beach with the person they loved. And that's what makes it so haunting. This happened back in 2013, and even now, more than a decade later, it's still the single scariest thing I've ever personally experienced. Not because anything jumped out at me or caused an accident, but because of how quiet it was, how fast it happened, and how there has never been an explanation that fully makes sense. I was driving home late at night. Sometime around midnight, I had just left my girlfriend's place and was in a good mood, relaxed, tired in that comfortable way you are after spending time with someone you care about. The roads were empty, the kind of empty you only really get that late at night. No traffic, no noise, just headlights cutting through the dark and music filling the car. At some point, I ended up driving behind a red truck, a red Ford Ranger. I remember that detail very clearly, even now. It wasn't right in front of me, but it wasn't far either. I'd say I was about 40 or 50 feet behind it. Close enough to clearly see it, its shape, its color, but far enough that I wasn't tailgating or anything like that. We were heading toward a bridge I knew well. It wasn't a small bridge. It was fairly long, with a noticeable peak in the middle. From one end of the bridge to the peak was roughly 3/4 of a mile, and the same distance down the other side. On top of that, the roads on either end of the bridge were long, straight stretches too, about another mile each way. No side roads, no exits, no turnoffs, just straight, open road. One of the reasons this bridge stands out so much in my memory is because of the visibility. When you're at the highest point, the middle of the bridge, you can see a long way in both directions, roughly 2 miles ahead, easily. Headlights, taillights, anything moving would be obvious. That night, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was just driving. Music was on, windows up. Everything felt normal. As the red truck and I approached the bridge, nothing seemed unusual. It maintained a steady speed. I maintained mine. We started going up toward the peak. Then, right before the truck crested the top of the bridge, I felt something that made my stomach drop. It was sudden and intense. That weird sinking feeling you get on a roller coaster right before the drop. Not fear, exactly, but anticipation mixed with unease. It didn't come from any thought. Nothing had happened yet. My body just reacted. I remember thinking, that's weird. The red truck reached the peak and went over it. From where I was, just behind the crest, I couldn't see what was on the other side yet. The slope of the bridge blocked my view. The truck disappeared from sight the way any vehicle does when it goes over a hill. 4 or 5 seconds passed. I reached the top of the bridge, and the truck was gone. Completely gone. At first, my brain didn't accept it. I expected to see the red truck somewhere down the road, even if it had sped up a bit. But when I looked ahead, there wasn't a single vehicle in sight. No taillights, no headlights coming the other way, nothing. Just empty road. I slowed down slightly, scanning the road, thinking maybe I'd missed something, but there was nowhere for it to go. No exits, no turnoffs, no side streets. Just a long, straight stretch of open highways stretching out in front of me. Even if that truck had slammed on the gas the second it went over the peak, it shouldn't have been able to vanish like that. Not in 4 or 5 seconds. Not with that kind of visibility. Even a supercar would still be visible at that distance. And this was a Ford Ranger, not exactly known for insane acceleration. My heart started pounding. I checked my mirrors. Nothing behind me either. The road was empty in every direction. It was like the truck had never been there at all. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter, my eyes darting back and forth, trying to make sense of it. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it turned off somehow and I didn't see it. Maybe it stopped suddenly and dipped out of sight. Maybe I misjudged the distance. But none of those explanations held up. There was no place for it to turn. No shoulder wide enough to pull off without being visible. No sound, no brake lights, no sign of anything unusual on the road ahead or behind. Just absence. That sinking feeling in my gut came back, stronger this time. The road felt different now. The music suddenly felt too loud, so I turned it down. I drove the rest of the bridge slowly, scanning the sides, the railings, the dark below, half expecting to see wreckage or lights or something that would explain where that truck went. There was nothing. When I reached the end of the bridge, I pulled over for a moment. I don't even remember consciously deciding to do it. I just needed to stop. I sat there in my car, engine idling, trying to calm myself down. I kept replaying the moment in my head. The truck ahead of me, the peak of the bridge, that feeling in my stomach, the empty road. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was just tired, that my eyes must have played tricks on me, that maybe the truck was farther ahead than I thought, and I just couldn't see it anymore. But deep down, that explanation never felt right. Over the years, I've tried to look it up. I searched online to see if there had ever been reports of a red truck driving off that bridge. An accident, a disappearance, anything that would line up with what I saw. I never found anything. No news articles, no reports, no mention of a Ford Ranger going over the side. That lack of confirmation somehow made it worse. If I had found a report, even one that didn't perfectly match the timeline, I think my brain would have latched onto it. I could have said, that's it, that's what happened. But there was nothing. Just my memory. And my memory is very clear. I know what I saw. I know how far behind that truck I was. I know how fast we were going. I know the layout of that bridge. And I know that vehicles don't just disappear like that. To this day, I still can picture that red Ford Ranger perfectly. The way it looked under my headlights, the way it crested the bridge, the exact moment it vanished. I don't tell this story often because I know how it sounds. People want explanations. They want logic, and I want that too. I don't jump straight to anything supernatural. I don't claim to know what happened. All I know is that something about that moment felt wrong before anything even happened. That feeling in my gut came first. And then reality did something I still can't explain. I've driven that bridge many times since, in daylight, at night, in traffic, alone. Every time I reach the peak, I think about that night. I look ahead a little longer than I need to. I always feel a slight tension in my chest until I'm fully past it. Nothing like that has ever happened again. But that night changed how I think about certainty, about how much we actually understand what we see, about how sometimes there are moments that don't fit neatly into reason, no matter how hard you try. I don't know if the truck went off the bridge. I don't know if I witnessed something tragic without realizing it. I don't know if my brain failed me for a few seconds in a way I've never experienced before or since. What I do know is that for a brief moment, something I knew to be real simply wasn't there anymore. And that feeling, that sudden realization that the world doesn't always behave the way you expect it to, is still the scariest thing I've ever felt. Up to this day, I still look back on this experience trying to find a logical explanation for what happened. I'm not someone who jumps to paranormal conclusions easily, and I've replayed that night in my head more times than I can count, searching for something that makes sense. This happened back in 2003, and even after all these years, the memory is still incredibly clear. At the time, I was staying at a coastal resort with my ex. It wasn't a crowded hotel or a busy tourist spot. The place was quiet and spread out. The cottages were individual units, spaced far apart from each other, probably around 200 meters or so. During the day, the distance felt peaceful and private. At night, it felt isolating. Our cottage was close to the shoreline, surrounded by sand, sparse vegetation, and darkness once the sun went down. There weren't many lights outside. Most of the illumination came from inside the cottages themselves. Once those lights were off, the area became pitch black except for the moon and distant ambient glow from other units far away. That night, everything was normal. We had checked in earlier, spent the evening relaxing, and eventually ended up in bed with a few beers. It was somewhere between 11 and 11:30 at night. We had turned off all the lights in the room, leaving only the television on. The TV cast a soft, flickering glow across the room, just enough to see shapes and movement, but not enough to fully light the space. The mood was relaxed. Nothing felt tense or strange. We were talking, half watching whatever was on TV, half lost in our own thoughts. The sound of the waves outside was steady and calming. If you had asked me in that moment whether I felt unsafe, I would have said no without hesitation. Then, without any warning, the doorknob rattled violently. It wasn't a light jiggle or an accidental bump. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect from wind or a loose handle. It was aggressive, forceful. Someone was clearly trying to open the door, twisting the knob back and forth hard, as if they were determined to get inside. The sound was so sudden and intense that my body reacted before my mind did. My heart immediately started racing. My ex froze, sitting upright in bed, staring at the door in shock. For a split second, neither of us spoke. The only sound in the room was the TV and the violent rattling of the door handle. I didn't think. I reacted. There was no double lock on the door. That realization hit me instantly and made the situation feel even more dangerous. My first instinct was to physically block the door. I jumped out of bed and threw my body against it, pressing my full weight into the wood, my back braced, my feet sliding slightly on the floor as I tried to anchor myself. The force of me hitting the door was loud. I'm certain whoever or whatever was on the other side heard it clearly. Despite that, the doorknob continued to twist and shake. It didn't slow down. It didn't hesitate. If anything, it felt just as determined as before. At this point, adrenaline had completely taken over. My thoughts were racing. I was trying to process who could possibly be out there. Resort staff? Unlikely, especially at that hour, and certainly not in that manner. Another guest? also unlikely, given how isolated the cottages were and how aggressive the attempt was. A drunk mistake didn't fit either. This didn't feel confused. It felt intentional. I lowered myself down, keeping my weight against the door, and pressed my face close to the floor. There was a small gap between the bottom of the door and the floor, enough for light or shadows to pass through. I figured that if someone was standing outside, I'd see their feet. At the very least, I'd see movement, a shadow, something. There was nothing. No feet, no shifting shadows, no change in light, nothing at all. The space beyond the door looked exactly the same as it had moments earlier, just darkness. But the doorknob was still rattling. That's when the fear shifted from panic to something colder and deeper, confusion mixed with dread. My brain struggled to reconcile what my ears were hearing with what my eyes were seeing. Someone was clearly manipulating the door handle, using force, yet there was no visible sign of anyone being there. I stayed like that, face close to the floor, straining my eyes, barely daring to breathe. The TV continued to flicker behind me. My ex was silent, likely terrified, watching me and the door, unsure of what to do. The rattling went on longer than it should have. It felt like forever, though in reality it was probably only seconds. Long seconds, stretched out by fear. Then suddenly it stopped. The doorknob went completely still. There was no final twist, no sound of someone stepping back, no footsteps moving away, no voices, no rustling in the sand. Just silence. That silence was almost worse than the noise. I stayed pressed against the door, listening as hard as I could. My ears rang with tension. I expected to hear something, anything, that would confirm someone had been there. But there was nothing. The sound of the ocean continued as if nothing had happened. We waited. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. I counted in my head, trying to decide how long was long enough to be sure. My muscles were tense, my body aching from holding the position, but I didn't dare pull away too soon. After a few minutes, I slowly shifted my weight and stood up. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking slightly. I hesitated before turning it, knowing that once I opened the door, whatever explanation I might find would either calm me or make things much worse. I opened the door. The night air rushed in, cool, quiet, empty. There was no one there. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. The sand surrounding the cottage was undisturbed. No footprints, no marks. Nothing to indicate anyone had been standing there moments earlier. The path leading away from the cottage was empty. The neighboring cottages were far off, their lights faint in the distance. There was no sound of retreat, no doors closing, no voices, no sign of movement anywhere. It was as if nothing had happened at all. We looked at each other, and without saying much, we both knew we weren't staying there another second. There was no discussion, no debate. The decision was instant and mutual. We grabbed our things as fast as we could, barely caring if we forgot something. We didn't finish our beers. We didn't turn the lights back on. We just wanted to leave. The entire cottage felt wrong now, like it had been violated in a way we couldn't explain. We left immediately. That night has stuck with me not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't see. If someone had been there and run off, I think I could have eventually rationalized it. A drunk guest. Someone looking for the wrong cottage. Even a would-be thief who got scared off. Those explanations, while unsettling, still fit within the boundaries of reality. But this didn't. The physical act of someone violently trying to open the door required presence. It required hands. It required a body applying force. And yet, there was no visible sign of anyone being there. No footsteps in the sand. No shadow under the door. No sound of retreat. I've thought about wind, but wind doesn't twist doorknobs back and forth aggressively. I've thought about faulty hardware, but the movement was too deliberate, too forceful. I've thought about some kind of prank, but the logistics don't line up. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to disappear to that quickly, without leaving a trace. I've even questioned my own memory. Maybe fear exaggerated the intensity. Maybe exhaustion played tricks on my perception. But the fact that both of us experienced it, heard it, reacted to it, and remember it the same way makes it hard to dismiss as imagination. What unsettles me most is how vulnerable we were. Lights off, isolated, no secondary lock, far from other people. Whoever or whatever was on the other side of that door knew we were inside. The TV glow would have made that obvious. And whatever it was, it tried to get in. Even now, I sometimes think about how long it had been there before it touched the door. Whether it was watching, whether it was waiting. That thought alone makes my skin crawl. I don't tell this story often because there's no satisfying conclusion. No explanation that ties everything together neatly. It's just a moment in time that doesn't make sense. And maybe never will. All I know is that in that moment, standing between the door and the darkness outside, listening to that knob rattle with no visible source, I felt a level of fear that was primal and absolute. And whatever that was, it was enough to make us leave without ever looking back. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers for daily true horror stories that stay with you long after they're told, quietly unsettling and meant for the late hours. You can also turn on notifications so you're always here when a new story arrives and the night begins to stir again. Now, let's continue. My father was a Vietnam veteran, but growing up, the war was something that lived in silence in our house. He never really talked about it, not in detail, not in stories, not in the way you see in movies or books. You could tell it was there, though. It showed up in his moods, in the way certain noises made him flinch, in the way he sometimes stared off into nothing like he was somewhere else entirely. Even as a kid, I could feel that Vietnam wasn't just a chapter in his life. It was something that followed him home and never really left. As children, we learned not to ask. Not because he told us not to, but because it felt wrong somehow. Pain has a way of making itself known without words. You could see it in his eyes when something reminded him of the war. He wasn't cold or distant, but there was a heaviness in him, like he carried something too large to put down. We knew he had seen things no one should have to see, and we respected that silence because it felt like the only thing we could do. As he got older, his health started to decline. Slowly at first, then all at once. He was in and out of hospitals, getting weaker, losing pieces of the man he used to be. Eventually, the doctors at the VA told us that what was happening to him was tied to his exposure to Agent Orange during his time in Vietnam. Chemicals sprayed decades earlier were still destroying his body. It felt cruel in a way that's hard to explain. He survived the war, came home, built a life, raised a family, only for it to catch up with him many years later. He passed away almost 8 years ago at the age of 68. That number still feels too small, too young, especially for someone who had already paid so much. Before he died, he was receiving full disability compensation from the VA. Part of that process required him to see a psychiatrist regularly. He didn't love those appointments, but he went because he needed to. One day, I took him to one of those appointments. He asked me to go in with him, not because he needed help speaking, but because he wanted support. That alone told me a lot. My father wasn't a man who asked for emotional support easily. We sat in a quiet office, Plain walls, neutral lighting, the kind of space designed to feel safe, but often feels clinical instead. The psychiatrist was calm and respectful, clearly experienced with veterans. After some general questions, he gently asked my father if he could talk about his time in Vietnam. Not everything, just something that stayed with him. At first, my father hesitated. You could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. He took a deep breath, looked down at his hands, and then began to speak. What he told that day is something I will never forget. He talked about a friend of his. Not just someone he knew, but someone he slept near, worked with, relied on. In war, friendships form fast and deep, because survival depends on the people around you. That bond is different from anything in normal life. He explained that at certain times, soldiers were warned that bombing runs were about to happen. Sirens would go off as a warning. They were told that if they were asleep and heard those sirens, they needed to cover themselves with whatever they had nearby. Anything that might provide even a small amount of protection. A pack, equipment, pieces of metal, whatever was available. It wasn't guaranteed to save them, but it could make the difference between life and death. One night, my father and his friend were sleeping when the sirens went off. My father woke up. He described that moment with painful clarity. The sound of the sirens cutting through sleep. The sudden jolt of fear. The training kicking in before his mind could fully process what was happening. He grabbed whatever he had near him and threw it over his body. He didn't even remember exactly what it was, only that he reacted fast. Then the bombs started falling. He didn't go into graphic detail, but he didn't have to. The way his voice changed said enough. The noise, the shaking, the feeling of the ground reacting to explosions, the uncertainty of whether the next one would be the one that hit you directly. When the bombing finally stopped, there was an eerie silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. My father crawled out from under what he had covered himself with, and that's when he saw his friend. His friend never woke up. He slept through the sirens. He never took cover. He had been decapitated by the bombing. When my father said that, his voice broke completely. He started crying in a way I had never seen before. Not quiet tears, not controlled emotion. This was raw, deep grief pouring out decades later, as fresh as if it had just happened. He said he remembered standing there, staring, unable to move, unable to understand how he was alive while his friend was gone. One moment they were sleeping near each other, sharing the same danger, the same space. The next moment, one of them no longer existed in the way a person should. He kept saying he should have woken him. That maybe if he had shaken him, yelled louder, done something, his friend might have lived. Even though logically he knew there was no guarantee, the guilt never left him. Survivor's guilt is a cruel thing. It doesn't care about logic. It doesn't fade with time. Sitting there listening to him, I realized that this was just one story, one moment, and he had carried it with him for his entire adult life. If one memory could still break him down like that, how many others were locked away inside him, never spoken, never released? The psychiatrist listened quietly, letting my father speak, letting him cry. There was no rushing him, no interruption. I had just space for something that had been buried for decades to finally come out. I sat there feeling helpless. I didn't know what to do except be there. To let him know he wasn't alone in that room, even if he had been alone with that memory for most of his life. After the appointment, we didn't talk much about it. He didn't suddenly open up about the war after that. If anything, it felt like that story had taken a lot out of him. But I was grateful he shared it, even though it hurt to hear. It helped me understand him in a way I never had before. That story changed how I see war forever. Not the political side of it, not the history or the headlines, but the human cost, the way a single moment can split lives into before and after. The way someone can survive physically, but carry the dead with them for the rest of their life. How my father lived with that memory for decades. It followed him through marriage, parenthood, work, illness. It was there in ways we couldn't always see. And when he finally shared it, near the end of his life, it felt like he was handing me something fragile and heavy, trusting me to carry it with respect. Even now, years after his death, that story stays with me. I think about his friend sometimes, someone I never knew, whose life ended in an instant. I think about my father, who lived, but paid for that survival in ways that aren't visible on the outside. I also think about how many veterans carry stories like this, locked away because there's no good place to put them. How many families live alongside that silence without fully understanding it. My father didn't talk much about Vietnam, but that one story told me everything I needed to know. It told me why the war never really ended for him, why certain things haunted him, why the pain stayed. And it's why I will never forget what he shared that day. This happened while we were visiting California. And even now it feels unreal when I think back on it. Like something my brain still hasn't fully accepted as a real memory. At the time, my wife and I were traveling with our daughter, who was about 10 months old. She was still so small, still in that stage where the world around her meant nothing beyond warmth, comfort, and familiar voices. We were staying with my father-in-law and spending a few days together, trying to enjoy time as a family. One day, we needed to drive into the city. My father-in-law had to take care of a traffic ticket at the courthouse, so we all piled into the car and headed out together. It felt like a completely normal errand. Nothing about that day suggested it would become one of the most disturbing things I've ever witnessed. We were talking casually. They focused on directions and parking, thinking about what we might do afterward. As we approached the courthouse, we turned into a large parking lot. There was a gate at the entrance with an attendant standing nearby, controlling who went in and out. Everything looked ordinary at first until a car ahead of us started acting strangely. It wasn't speeding like a car on a highway, but it was definitely moving too fast for a parking lot, especially one near a courthouse with pedestrians around. At first I thought maybe the driver was just impatient or careless. Then I noticed the gate attendant. He wasn't calmly waving cars through. He was moving quickly, almost running, clearly trying to catch the attention of the driver, or stop the car from going further into the lot. That immediately raised alarms in my head. You don't usually see a guard chasing a car unless something is very wrong. We slowed down, confused, trying to understand what we were seeing. The car continued deeper into the lot instead of stopping. If anything, it seemed to pick up speed. That's when something happened that made my stomach drop. The passenger door opened while the car was still moving. A woman fell out. She didn't step out or climb out carefully. She fell. It looked uncontrolled, desperate, like she had been trying to escape. She hit the ground hard and rolled, then scrambled to her feet. For a second, my brain couldn't process it. I remember thinking, did I really just see that? My wife and I both stared in disbelief. We hadn't even entered the lot fully yet. We were still just outside the gate, and instinctively, I stopped the car. Everything in my body told me not to move forward. Something terrible was unfolding right in front of us. The car came to a stop a short distance ahead. The driver jumped out immediately and started running after the woman. That alone was terrifying. It didn't look like a normal argument or confusion. It looked like a chase, a predator chasing prey. The woman was screaming, not yelling, screaming. That sound cuts through everything. It instantly tells you that this isn't just chaos. It's danger. The parking lot attendant was now running too, chasing after the driver, clearly trying to intervene or get help. People nearby were starting to freeze, unsure whether to run, hide, or help. Everything was happening so fast that there was no time to think, only to react. That's when I noticed something that made my heart race even faster. The driver had a knife. It was visible in his hand as he ran. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't a threat that might escalate. This was already violent, lethal. The woman ran toward the courthouse steps, probably the only place she could think of where there would be security, people, and protection. She was moving as fast as she could, but panic and fear slow you down in ways you don't expect. The driver was gaining on her. At that point, my entire focus was split in two. Part of me was watching this horrifying scene unfold. The other part of me was painfully aware that my wife and infant daughter were sitting in the car with me. My daughter was strapped into her rear-facing car seat, completely unaware of what was happening just yards away. She was safe, at least for the moment. But the realization that we were so close to such extreme violence made my chest tighten. Everything escalated in seconds. Courthouse police officers came running out, 3 of them moving with urgency and purpose. Their guns were drawn. They were shouting commands, yelling for the man to stop. Their voices were loud, authoritative, cutting through the screaming and chaos. The woman reached the steps, but the man caught her. He tackled her to the ground. That moment felt like time slowed down. My brain screamed that this was it, that something irreversible was about to happen. He still had the knife. She was on the ground beneath him. The police were closing in, but they were still seconds away. Then the gunshots rang out. 4 or 5 shots, loud, sharp, real. For a split second, I was sure I had just watched 2 people die. My mind couldn't separate what I was seeing from what I feared had happened. The sound echoed in the open space, and everything felt surreal, like I had stepped into a nightmare without warning. And then something unexpected happened. The woman got up. She moved quickly, almost stumbling as she stood, but she was alive. One of the officers grabbed her and rushed her into the courthouse immediately, shielding her, getting her out of harm's way. That image is burned into my mind. The contrast between what I thought had just happened and what was actually happening left me stunned. The other 2 officers approached the man cautiously, guns still aimed at him. He was on the ground, moving, writhing slightly. For a brief moment, it looked like he might still be alive. Then his movements slowed. Then they stopped. The parking lot fell into a strange kind of silence. Not true silence, but that stunned quiet that follows something violent and final. People were frozen. No one seemed to know what to say or do. My wife turned to me, shaken, asking if those were real gunshots. She thought maybe they were beanbags or something less lethal. I didn't answer right away because I already knew the truth. There was no mistaking that sound. Those were real bullets. I looked back at my daughter in the rearview mirror. She was still calm, still oblivious, looking around or maybe dozing. The fact that she had no idea what had just happened felt like both a relief and a heartbreak. I was grateful she didn't understand. But it also hit me how close we were to something that could have affected her forever. I made a decision immediately. We weren't staying. I turned the car around and left the area. I didn't wait to be told to move. I didn't want to be there anymore. I wanted distance between my family and what had just happened. My hands were shaking as I drove, adrenaline still pumping through my body. Later, we saw the news reports. They explained what we had witnessed. The woman had been in an abusive relationship. The man had been physically abusing her. Somehow she convinced him to take her to the courthouse, possibly under the excuse of dealing with the traffic ticket. That was her chance. She knew there would be police there. She knew it might be her only opportunity to escape. She took it. She jumped out of the car and ran. He chased her with a knife, and the courthouse police shot and killed him to stop the attack. Knowing that context didn't make the memory easier, but it did give it shape. It wasn't random violence. It was desperation. It was survival. It was a woman risking everything for a chance to live. What still amazes me, even now, is the precision of the police response. They fired into a situation where two people were tangled together, one attacking the other, and somehow they stopped the threat without injuring her. That level of control, under that amount of pressure, is hard to comprehend unless you see it with your own eyes. At the same time, watching someone be killed, even someone doing something terrible, changes you. It doesn't matter that it was justified. It doesn't matter that it saved a life. Your brain still has to process the reality that you saw another human being die violently in front of you. For a long time afterward, it didn't feel real. It felt like something I had watched on a screen, not something that happened in front of my own eyes, but certain details kept bringing it back. The sound of the shots, the scream, the moment the woman got up, the way the man stopped moving. I thought a lot about how close we were, about how easily we could have been a few seconds earlier or later, about how different the day could have been if that woman hadn't found the courage to act when she did, about how violence hides in plain sight, even in places that are supposed to represent order and justice. Mostly I thought about my daughter. She was 10 months old, too young to understand anything. But one day, she'll be grown. She'll move through the world on her own. She'll trust people. She'll make choices. And the idea that danger can appear so suddenly, so violently, is something that never really leaves you once you've witnessed it firsthand. That day didn't just scare me. It changed the way I see things. It made me more aware of how fragile normal life really is. One minute, you're driving to a courthouse to deal with a ticket. The next, you're watching a life or death struggle play out in front of you. I'm grateful my family walked away from it unharmed. I'm grateful my daughter was shielded from the trauma of it. I'm grateful that woman survived. But I don't think I'll ever fully shake the feeling of disbelief that comes with knowing I watched cops shoot and kill a man just feet away from my car. Even now, years later, it still feels like something that shouldn't have happened, even though I know it did. And that's what makes it so unsettling. Not just the violence, but the realization that moments like that exist quietly alongside everyday life, waiting for the wrong place and the wrong time to collide. It's something I'll carry with me forever. This is still the scariest thing that ever happened to me as a child. Not because anything actually happened, but because of how close it felt to something going very wrong and how powerless we were in that moment. It was also the first time I became aware of fear in a very adult way, the kind of fear that doesn't scream or panic, but goes completely silent and cold. We were camping with my family and a family we were close friends with. It was one of those group camping trips that felt exciting as a kid, full of freedom and novelty. There were campers set up in a loose cluster, adults chatting, kids running around, fires going, food cooking. Everything felt safe and familiar because it was surrounded by people we trusted. As the night went on, the adults drank more than usual. Not in a violent or angry way, just the kind of loud, a sloppy, happy drinking that ends with people laughing too hard and eventually passing out wherever they sit. By the time it got late, the fires had burned down to embers and most of the parents had retreated into their campers, exhausted and very drunk. Because of that, my friend, her cousin, and I were allowed to sleep in a tent together instead of a camper. At the time, that felt like the coolest thing in the world. We were old enough to feel grown, but still young enough to think danger only existed in obvious forms. The tent was set up a short distance away from the campers, close enough that we knew people were nearby, but far enough that it felt private and special. Inside the tent, we were buzzing with that late-night energy kids get when they know they're supposed to be sleeping but aren't. We whispered, giggled quietly. I talked about random things that felt incredibly important in the moment. Eventually, though, the excitement started to fade. Our voices got softer. The pauses between sentences got longer. We were settling into that in-between space right before sleep. It was probably around midnight. The campground had gone quiet in a way that felt different from earlier in the night. No more laughter, no more music, just the occasional crackle from dying embers and the ambient nighttime sounds you barely notice until everything else stops. Crickets, distant rustling, the kind of quiet that makes you suddenly aware of how dark it really is. That's when we heard it. The sound of shoes crunching on gravel. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, deliberate, close. The kind of sound you immediately recognize as footsteps, not an animal, not the wind. Human footsteps. And then, almost at the same time, we heard the jingle of a dog collar on a leash. All three of us froze. We weren't panicking yet. It was more like our bodies locked up before our brains could catch up. We stopped whispering mid-thought. No one moved. We just listened. Footsteps slowed, then stopped. A shadow appeared on the side of the tent that faced the gravel road. It wasn't sharp or detailed, just a soft outline, but it was unmistakably the shape of a tall man. You could tell by the height, the shoulders, the way he stood. The shadow lingered there, close enough that it felt invasive, like he was right on top of us, even though there was still fabric between us. I remember the silence inside the tent being absolute. Not a breath, not a shift of fabric. It felt like even blinking would be too loud. I could see the whites of my friend's eyes in the dim light, wide and locked on each other, silently asking the same question. What do we do? Then the man spoke. His voice was soft, not aggressive, not loud, almost casual. That somehow made it worse. Hey there, girlies. Every muscle in my body went tight. That word alone made my stomach drop. Girlies. It felt wrong in a way I didn't yet have the language to explain. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't normal. It felt like something he had no right to say to us. None of us answered. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I remember being aware of my own heartbeat, how loud it sounded in my ears, and wondering if he could hear it too. I was terrified that he would hear us breathing or sense us inside the tent, even though that was ridiculous. Fear isn't rational. What are you girls up to so late? He asked. Still, we said nothing. We were children, but something instinctual took over. We knew that responding would acknowledge him, that it would turn us from unseen into engaged. Even though we didn't consciously plan it, all three of us understood that silence felt safer than anything we could say. I remember thinking about the campers. They were close enough that we could see them earlier. But in that moment, they felt a million miles away. Inside those campers were our younger siblings, asleep and helpless, and our parents, passed out and drunk, completely unaware of what was happening. Even if we screamed, would they wake up in time? Would they understand what was happening? Or would it just cause chaos and confusion? We were very suddenly aware that we were on our own. The man didn't speak again right away. Instead, he hummed quietly to himself, not loudly, just enough that we could hear it, like he was thinking, like he was considering something. That sound still unsettles me when I think about it. It felt deliberate, like he knew exactly what he was doing, like he was enjoying the moment of uncertainty. The dog shifted slightly, the collar jingling again. Time felt strange. I don't know how long he stood there. It could have been seconds. It could have been a minute. In my memory, it feels endless. My body felt frozen in a way I had never experienced before, like fear had turned me into something solid and immobile. Then the shadow moved. Slowly it pulled away from the tent. The footsteps resumed, crunching on gravel, getting quieter as he continued down the road. The jingle of the dog collar faded with them. We stayed frozen long after the sounds disappeared. None of us spoke. None of us moved. I don't know what we were waiting for, maybe confirmation that he was truly gone. Or maybe we just didn't know how to exist normally again after that moment. Eventually, one of us whispered something. I don't even remember what. It didn't matter. The spell broke just enough for us to breathe again. Later, when we talked about it, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just some drunk guy walking his dog. That's a very reasonable explanation. Campgrounds have all kinds of people. People drink. People wander. People make poor choices without malicious intent. But even if that's true, it doesn't erase how it felt. That was the first time I realized that fear doesn't always come with obvious danger. Sometimes it comes quietly, politely, wrapped in something that could almost be explained away. And sometimes the scariest part isn't what happens, but what could have happened. It was also the first time I realized that in a situation like that, I didn't have the right instincts yet. I didn't know if we should scream, run, speak, or stay silent. We chose silence, and in this case, it worked. But at the time, it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like paralysis. 2 hours later, one of us had to pee. By then, we had calmed down a little. Enough to convince ourselves that the danger had passed. Enough to move. Enough to think rationally again. But that walk to the outhouses was the most paranoid journey of my childhood. Every shadow looked like a person. Every sound felt amplified. We moved fast, constantly looking over our shoulders, hearts pounding all over again. The outhouses had never felt so far away. When we finally made it back to the tent and zipped it closed behind us, the relief was overwhelming. Nothing else happened that night. But something had changed. That experience stuck with me, not as a dramatic story with a clear villain, but as a quiet lesson. A moment where I realized that safety is fragile, and that being young and protected is something you don't even notice until it cracks. To this day, I don't know exactly who that man was or what he intended. Maybe it really was nothing. Maybe he didn't mean harm. But fear doesn't require certainty. It only requires enough unknowns to make your body react before your mind can catch up. That night was the first time I understood that sometimes the scariest moments don't come with answers, and they don't end with resolution. They just leave you older in a way you didn't ask for. And that's why it still stands out as the scariest thing that ever happened to me as a child. I lived in Germany for a couple of years, and during that time I met people whose life stories stayed with me in a way I never expected. These weren't stories told for attention or drama. They were shared quietly, sometimes reluctantly, usually only after trust had been built. They were the kind of stories that make you realize how close history really is, how it lives on inside people, shaping them long after the events themselves have ended. Two of those people come to mind more often than the others, and both stories are heartbreaking in very different ways. The first was a woman I met who survived Auschwitz. She didn't talk about it often. In fact, most people who knew her had no idea what she had been through unless she chose to tell them. When she did speak about it, her voice was calm, almost detached, as if distance was the only way she could survive the memory. But every now and then, something in her expression would change, and you could see how close the pain still was, even decades later. She grew up in Berlin and was in high school toward the end of the Second World War. She was young, intelligent, and outspoken in a way that was incredibly dangerous at that time. She became pregnant while still in school, which already put her in a vulnerable position in a society that was tightly controlled and unforgiving. Life during the final years of the war was chaotic, tense, and filled with fear. People watched what they said, even among friends, because a careless comment could destroy your life. One day, her teacher announced to the class that they would be working periodically in a munitions factory as a form of community service. It was framed as something patriotic, something expected. Most students stayed quiet. Saying nothing was the safest option. She didn't. She made a joke, something sarcastic, saying that she wasn't going to make guns for Hitler. It may have felt like a small act of defiance in the moment, maybe even a way to cope with the absurdity and horror of the situation. But in that environment, words were dangerous weapons. Someone reported her to the Gestapo. She didn't know immediately, but she found out quickly enough to understand what it meant. Being reported was often a death sentence, or at least the beginning of one. She didn't wait to see what would happen. She ran. She fled Berlin and went to stay with relatives near Dresden. There, away from the immediate danger, she gave birth to her daughter. Becoming a mother in the middle of war should have been terrifying enough on its own. But for her, it came with an added layer of fear. She knew that if the authorities found her child, the baby could be taken from her, used against her, or worse. In an act that still feels almost impossible to imagine, she made a decision that no parent should ever have to make. To protect her baby, she left her daughter behind with relatives and returned to Berlin. She believed that by removing herself from her child's life, she might keep the Gestapo from ever finding the baby. It worked, but at a terrible cost. When she returned to Berlin, she was caught. She was labeled a political dissident and sent to Auschwitz. Nothing can truly prepare someone for what Auschwitz was. It was not just a prison or a labor camp. It was a system designed to strip people of their humanity piece by piece. She arrived there already traumatized, already separated from her child, already aware that she might never see her again. While imprisoned there, she was subjected to constant abuse. She spoke about it without going into graphic detail, but the meaning was clear. The guards raped her almost daily. There was no escape, no protection, no justice. Her body was treated as something disposable, something to be used and discarded. She became pregnant multiple times and suffered several miscarriages under conditions that were unimaginably cruel. At some point, she was selected by Dr. Joseph Mengele. She described what happened in plain, blunt terms. He performed a hysterectomy on her, not as a medical necessity, not with care, but as an act of control and experimentation. She described it as him ripping out her uterus, The goal was to prevent her from ever becoming pregnant again. But even that was not the end of her suffering. After the procedure, she was not spared further abuse. She was simply returned to the guards, her body permanently altered, her ability to have children taken from her. But her suffering continued. The cruelty was systematic, layered, relentless. She survived in Auschwitz until its liberation in January 1945. Survival, however, did not mean freedom in the way people often imagine it. When the camp was liberated, she was still weak, traumatized, and alone. She was handed off between different Allied armed forces, each unsure what to do with her. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a citizen with clear paperwork. She was a survivor of something most people didn't yet fully understand. Eventually, she made her way back to Berlin. But even then, her nightmare wasn't over. Europe was in ruins. Records were destroyed. Families were scattered across countries, camps, and graves. Finding loved ones became its own kind of trauma. She had left her daughter behind to save her life, but now she had no idea where her child was or even if she was still alive. It took years of searching, asking, waiting, hoping, and fearing the worst. She wasn't reunited with her daughter until the early 1950s. By then, her child had grown up without her, shaped by years of separation and uncertainty. Their reunion was joyful, but it was also complicated. Time and trauma had changed them both. You don't simply step back into the life you left behind. You build something new from what remains. The woman survived Auschwitz. He survived unimaginable violence, survived loss, and somehow built a life afterward. But survival didn't mean she was untouched. The war followed her in quiet ways for the rest of her life. In her silences, in her strength, in the sadness that sometimes flickered across her face when she thought no one was watching. The second story comes from a man I knew who served compulsory time as a soldier during the Cold War. He was small in stature, only about 5'2", but there was a quiet firmness about him. He wasn't loud or aggressive. He wasn't someone who talked about politics much. But when he did talk about his time in the military, you could tell it had shaped him deeply. He was stationed on the Berlin Wall. For those who didn't live through it, the Berlin Wall is often remembered as a symbol, a line on a map, a concrete barrier. But for the people who stood guard there, it was a place where life and death decisions could happen in seconds. It wasn't just a wall. It was a boundary enforced by violence. One night, while on duty, he witnessed a man sprinting across no man's land. The man was trying to escape from East Berlin to West Berlin, running for his life, fully aware that being seen could mean being shot. My friend saw him and immediately understood what was happening. He had no love for the communist regime. He didn't believe in the system he was serving. In that moment, his instinct was to let the man go, to look the other way, to give him a chance at freedom. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. Then his commanding officer saw the fleeing man too. The officer ran up to my friend, furious, panicked, and full of authority. He screamed in my friend's face, now ordering him to raise his rifle and shoot the man. There was no hesitation in the command, no moral consideration, just obedience. My friend froze. He didn't move. He didn't raise his rifle. That hesitation was enough to put his own life in danger. The commanding officer pulled out his pistol, pointed it directly at my friend's head, and screamed at him again. He told him, very clearly, that if he didn't shoot the man trying to escape, the officer would kill him instead. In that moment, my friend was trapped between two impossible choices: kill an innocent man trying to escape, or be killed himself for refusing. Something inside him snapped, not in fear, but in defiance. He turned to his commanding officer, threw his rifle into the officer's face, and yelled that if the officer wanted the man dead, he should shoot him himself. It was an act of pure courage and pure desperation. For a few seconds, everything hung in the balance. The fleeing man continued running. The officer stood there, shocked, humiliated, angry. The pistol was still raised, but the officer didn't pull the trigger. Whether he lacked the nerve, feared consequences, or simply wasn't as committed to violence as he pretended to be, he backed off. The moment passed. The man running for freedom disappeared into the darkness and survived. My friend survived too. He was punished later, of course. Disobedience in the military, especially in that environment, was not taken lightly. But punishment was a small price to pay compared to what could have happened. He lived with the consequences, but he lived. When he told this story, there was no pride in his voice, no bravado. Just a quiet certainty that he had done the only thing he could live with. He knew how close he had come to dying. He knew how close he had come to killing someone. That knowledge stays with you. Both of these people lived through moments where the world demanded something terrible of them. One was crushed by a system designed to destroy. The other was ordered to become an executioner. Both resisted in their own ways. Both survived. And both carried the weight of those moments for the rest of their lives. Meeting people like that changes how you see history. It stops being something abstract or distant. It becomes personal. It becomes human. You realize that behind every statistic, every headline, every date in a textbook, there are real people who made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. Those stories still come back to me, often unexpectedly. They remind me how fragile ordinary life is, and how much courage it can take simply to remain human when the world is trying to take that away from you. If you're still here, then these stories didn't simply fade away. They settled in. Every story you heard tonight came from real moments, real people, and real situations where something felt off or nearly went wrong. If you want to keep exploring stories that linger in your thoughts long after the night grows quiet, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers. There are more stories waiting in the dark, and not all of them let you leave in time.